Okay, are we live?
Yes.
Great. Hello and welcome to another webinar part of the SwaCon series, which is jointly hosted by the Swatantrata Center and the South Asia Students for Liberty. Today we have a very interesting topic of conversation, and our speaker for today is Samuel Bowman. He is the Director of Competition Policy at the International Center for Law and Economics, where he manages the center's work on competition and platform regulation issues in the US and overseas. Before joining ICLE in 2020, he was a principal at Fingleton, a London-based regulatory and competition advisory firm, where he advised corporate clients on competition and public policy issues. And before that, he was the executive director of the Adam Smith Institute, one of Europe's leading think tanks. He holds degrees in economics and history from the University College Cork and the University of London. Samuel, welcome to this conversation, and thank you for joining us. Sam would be talking on liberalism and centrism, something that's very relevant and sort of tells us about the crisis in semantics that people who identify themselves as liberals face. Now, without further ado, I'd give it over to you, Sam.
Great. Thanks so much, Anas. And thanks everybody for tuning in. It's a real pleasure to speak to people. I'm hoping that the presentation I have is interesting, coming from somebody in the UK, which is obviously a country that is shrinking as a share of the global economy and is shrinking in global importance. And I think that hopefully there are lots of ideas that may be interesting to people across borders, and in particular, people from a country like India that's growing so rapidly in global importance and so rapidly as a kind of crucial part of the global economy. The kind of points I want to make today, I think, could be of interest, not just to people in countries like the UK that I think have seen kind of deep economic malaise. And a lot of what I'm talking about, you'll see the kind of economic stagnation that the Western world has experienced for the last 10 or 12 years really informs a lot of what I'm saying. But I think a lot of the lessons may also be of interest to people in countries with rapidly growing economies as well. I'm going to share my screen and hope that people can see what I'm doing. Oh, I have to just apologies. I have a slight technical. Oh, okay. Zoom will not be able to record the contents of your screen until it is quit. So I suppose I'll just not share my screen, but just speak instead, rather than quitting out. And Anas can jump in and interrupt me if you'd like me to just rejoin. So apologies about that. But the argument that I want to make is that the idea of centrism is something that is often very appealing to liberals, and liberals, whether they're left liberals or right liberals, feel that centrism is a kind of a convenient way of describing where they fall on the political landscape. That it's just as easy to say that you're a centrist as to say that you're a liberal. And for those of you who are familiar with the kind of political compass, where you have two axes, one goes from authoritarian to socially liberal on the bottom, and then from economically left to economically right. The argument that I want to make is that centrism, the idea that liberals are sort of in the middle of that, and that liberals are the kind of the moderate group in opposition to kind of extremists on all ends, is basically mistaken and ends up aligning liberals with the wrong sorts of people, and really aligning liberals with people who've been badly discredited over the last few years. So to begin with, we might think about what an idealized model of centrism looks like. So if you were to describe centrism as a political philosopher, you might argue that it's about finding the balance between extremes. So it's about finding the best from left, the best from right, the best from authoritarianism, and the best from kind of libertarianism, and trying to find a kind of happy middle, a happy kind of in between. And what this kind of leads you to is this idea of people or experts or elites as piecemeal problem solvers. So on an issue by issue basis, they look at all the facts of the case, they look at all the different arguments that are being made, and then they use their brains or they use their expertise to make a decision about what the best kind of theory or what the best approach for that particular case is, with no kind of underlying theory. And that's certainly the, I think, the dominant ideology of elites in the Western world. I think certainly in countries like the UK and in Europe, the idea that elites are kind of somewhere in the middle of left and right is very, very popular. And there's this idea that these elites should be using their kind of expertise and should be drawing on expertise to adjudicate between lots of different ideological debates. And you'll know if you meet these people that they feel that they're very above the idea of ideology, and they feel that basically ideology is kind of something for other people who don't know as much about these issues as they do. Now, I think that in reality, one of the problems with this approach, and I don't mean to say that it's terrible, but one of the problems with this approach is that it often actually is paralyzed by having no underlying model of the world. The world is extremely complicated, and because the world is so complex, and because there's so much in the world, there's a kind of superabundance of information. You could spend your entire life reading the news, for example. You could spend literally every single waking moment of your life reading different news reports, learning new things about the world that was going on. And most people can't do that, and most people shouldn't do that. It's not a very good use of your time. And so you need some kind of filter to understand what's important and understand what things you should focus on. And I consider that filter to be a form that's really what we mean by ideology, or that's one of the things that we mean by ideology. Secondly, we need a way of discerning between good evidence and bad evidence. And what I mean by that is often in science and often in social science, results that are initially kind of promising or that initially look like they're appealing later on turn out not to be true. Now, this is just part of science. We'll talk about that a little bit later, of a scientific method a little bit later, but one needs to not be completely naive to new evidence. One needs a way of saying, based on other things that I know, or based on other things that I believe, this new evidence seems less likely than not, or less likely than kind of average to be true. So if you were a naive centrist, or if you were a naive sort of non-ideological person, really, if you took that seriously, you wouldn't have that kind of prior belief, because that kind of prior belief is really what we mean by an ideology. Now, the flip side of that is that people with strong ideologies are resistant to new information that's true just because it contradicts what they believe. That's basically what we call dogmatism. So, bearing with me, what I'm trying to describe is the kind of trade-off between ideology, which gives you a sort of model to think about the world, but also makes you more closed-minded, and what I consider to be centrism, which sort of says it doesn't have a model, or if it does have a model, it's about sort of piecemeal problem solving, but which ends up becoming completely paralyzed by the overabundance, the superabundance of different theories and different pieces of evidence and different things that one can focus on. And that lack of an underlying model means that ultimately centrism is reliant on the intelligence of the individual or the ability of the institution to get things right. So ultimately, because you're effectively saying there isn't this external theory of the world that I can look at or that I'm kind of contributing to, you're saying I myself can judge, I can weigh up all these pieces of evidence, and I myself can judge without really relying on reliance on others what's true and what's not. This has the related problem of having no clarity about the goals of public policy. Because centrism doesn't really have a theory of what's good, it often can lead to contradictions in public policy. So for example, if you have an expert can tell you what, but an expert usually, as we understand expertise, can't tell you if you should do something or why you should do something. Experts are good at giving you tools, and expertise is good at giving you tools for understanding things, but it's less good at telling you what it is that you should be aiming towards and what really is good in the world. And because you lack that kind of guiding motivation or that guiding this is the thing that we're aiming towards, it can lead to contradictions. As I say, you can have different policies aiming at different things and sometimes aiming at things that cross over each other, Or you can have capture of institutions, where a group of people who do have a firm idea about what's good take over that institution by going to work for it, by working together, and by kind of shifting it in a particular direction. Sometimes capture like that is good. If you have a bad institution, or if you have an aimless institution, and people with good means or motives take it over, then that kind of capture can be a good thing. But in a democratic society, we generally think that those decisions should not be made by the people who work in those institutions, let's say a central bank or a competition regulator or some other government department. We generally think it should be society that makes that kind of decision. And it should be people like the people who kind of are engaged in public debate who make those sorts of decisions, not the people who happen to work at those institutions. And I think that one of the problems with this approach is that this centrist ideology has been politically discredited. The fact that, for example, centrists, so to speak, the kind of elites that at least govern lots of Western political discourse, didn't really have anything to say about the financial crisis. They didn't really have anything to say about the subsequent long period of slow growth in the developed world. And they didn't really have a kind of an underlying argument about what we're aiming towards, about what society should look like or what society could look like. A lot of people have begun to feel very dissatisfied with this. And as a result, they're turning to, and have been turning to, the extreme left and the extreme right for answers, because the extreme left and the extreme right give people a sense of purpose, and they give people a sense of what's good. And often they say that they have the answers. So, is liberalism just a form of a kind of a moderate version of extreme left or extreme right? My argument is that no. So my fundamental argument here is that liberalism is itself is fundamentally really the opposite of left and right-wing extremism. The opposite is not moderation of those things. It's not some sort of middle ground between extreme left and extreme right. It's a different thing altogether that challenges a lot of the assumptions that extreme left and extreme right thinking implies. And I talk about the extreme left and the extreme right as very close things. It's a kind of it's a cliche to talk about this sort of idea that the extreme left and the extreme right actually have a lot in common with each other. But I think it's worth considering what things they do have in common with each other. For example, both tell us that human affairs are zero-sum games, by which I mean, if you win, somebody else has to lose. If I want to have a better life, that means somebody else has to have a worse life. Now, when it comes to the left, they typically talk about the economy as being a zero-sum game. Somebody gets rich because they have exploited somebody else. When we come to the right, they typically talk about it as being something to do with identity groups. People, for example, if a right-wing extremist, somebody, let's say like Donald Trump, who is not the most extreme, but is certainly a right-wing extremist, talks to white working class people in America and constantly uses the language of grievance. He constantly uses this sort of rhetoric that says that they have been exploited. Often he talks about China exploiting them. Domestically, he might talk about immigrant groups exploiting the kind of native white workers. And this is something that is not just a feature of right-wing extremism, but it's a very fundamental part of right-wing extremism. The idea that your group is what defines you, that whether it's your membership of a certain class or whether it's your membership of a certain race or a religion or sex, the extreme left and the extreme right have the view that the individual's characteristics are much less important than the group characteristics that they belong to, because they see human affairs as being zero-sum. They see it as this struggle between different groups, and ultimately that struggle between different groups has to have a winner and has to have a loser. And this leads to the sort of politics that we've seen over the last few years, of politics as a struggle between different interest groups or different identity groups. And it's a self-fulfilling, it's a vicious cycle, because as more people on the other side, as more people in a group that isn't yours, kind of decides that their group is important, and that you are, or that people like you are members of a kind of class that is their enemy, then there's a natural tendency for people who are being spoken to that way to kind of think of themselves in opposition to that. And so there's a kind of vicious cycle that reinforces the extreme left and extreme right politics. And we saw this kind of tragically in the 20th century in Europe, in countries like Germany, where the rise of the far left led to the rise of the far right, which led to the rise of the far left, and so on, until really there was no, as people then called it, center left. My argument is that really liberalism is not a moderate view, that it's in between these things. Liberalism is really the opposite of this view of human affairs as zero sum. And it's the opposite of the view of human affairs as being group-based. That it should be considered to be really a philosophy of liberalism, sorry, a philosophy of individualism, and one of kind of mutual flourishing, of both sides winning, of win-win interactions. And I argue that what defines liberalism at the base of all of this are two specific liberal values. The first value is that each person is morally equal to each other person. And the second value is, because of this, each person may choose for themselves what counts as a good life for them. Now, these two premises they seem like they're very trivial. They seem like kind of almost anybody would agree with these two premises. Moral egalitarianism, we're all equal to each other, and each person gets to decide what they think is good in life. But in practice, I think these ideas are almost kind of revolutionary. There's an extreme rejection, really, in almost every political ideology, or in almost every kind of walk of life, of the idea of moral egalitarianism. So by moral egalitarianism, this idea that everybody's interests should be weighed equally, regardless of anything else about them. We don't mean to say that everybody's outcomes should be the same. We don't even mean to say that everybody's opportunities should be the same, although it may be good for people's outcomes to be the same for other reasons, or it may be good for people's opportunities to be the same for other reasons. It just says that people's interests should be weighed equally. And by that, I mean, harm to one person is the same and just as bad as harm to another person, irrespective of anything else that we know about those people. There's nothing that we can know about person A that makes us think that it's better for bad things to happen to person A than it is for bad things to happen to person B. Now, among centrists, or among kind of elite opinion that I would not consider to be liberal, these people mostly do agree with the idea of egalitarianism when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, when it comes to religion, and that's all very good. And that's one of the reasons the world is a lot better now than it was, in much of the 20th century. But still, even people like that find the idea of egalitarianism, and when it comes to things like nationality, or when it comes to things like intellect, to be very, very challenging. And they kind of find it almost repugnant to say that a state, or that the well-being of a person on the other side of the world is equal in moral weight to the well-being of somebody within your own country. Especially when it comes to elites talking about intelligence, they find the idea of egalitarianism to be very, very challenging. The kind of fundamental value of elites, particularly in the UK, is one of social mobility as fairness. This is the idea that we should set up society in such a way that smart people who are born into bad circumstances can escape those circumstances. But the underlying, and that might be a good idea, incidentally, for economic reasons. I think it is a good idea for economic reasons. And I think it's a good idea to make sure that when we find smart people, we give them as many resources as possible so that they can maximize their ability, they can set up companies and so on. But I don't think there's anything fair about it, because the implication of this is that to be smart, or to be born intelligent, means that you're more deserving of a good life for moral reasons than somebody who's not born intelligent. Now, this, I think, is very, very, this is contradictory to the idea of moral egalitarianism. There's nothing about somebody who's born intelligent that means that it's better for things that are good to happen to them, or that they feel pain differently to other people, or that somebody who isn't born intelligent, or isn't born with kind of marketable gifts is in some way more deserving of a bad life than somebody who is born intelligent. Now, the reason that I really focus on this and really stress this is that I think that a large part of the political resentments that we've built up over the last few decades are partly because of this idea that smart people are more deserving of a good life than other people. And so we have this sort of split between elites, who are generally smart people and who are often people who've been born into very difficult backgrounds, who've then risen. And while that might be good pragmatically for the economy, it isn't necessarily just. And yet, those people want to describe it as just and want to think of it as just. And that leads to a huge amount of resentment among other people. And I think it leads to those other people being neglected in the eyes of public policy. But if we take moral egalitarianism seriously, and if we say that each person is in fact of moral value equal to everybody else. That leads us to the second premise that I have, the second kind of liberal value that I argue exists, which is anti-paternalism. And really, anti-paternalism says nobody can tell another person how they should live their life. Nobody can tell another person what's good and override that other person's idea of what's good. The reason for that is that we have no moral standing over each other, that if we're all equal, if we all have a kind of morally equal weight, it's not possible for me to say, I have greater authority, I can tell you what's good. It's contradictory. To be able to tell somebody else that they are wrong about what's good and you are right about what's good implies moral superiority, which if we take moral egalitarianism seriously, we can't do. But paternalism is just as deeply ingrained or more deeply ingrained in society than the kind of idea of moral inegalitarianism. Paternalism is basically everywhere. We force people to study certain subjects at university. Unemployment systems force people to look for jobs. Sometimes they force people to look for certain jobs. Public health, tragically, as we've been seeing throughout the COVID epidemic, the public health authorities in the UK, for example, had spent decades focusing on individual people's health, not on the spread of disease, not on the public, people's likelihood of catching a disease from somebody else, but instead on the decisions that individuals have made about their own health, saying that those are the wrong decisions. So obese people, smokers, alcoholics, whatever it might be. And I think the most damaging and dangerous paternalism of all is the idea of speech paternalism, which is really the idea that people should not be able to hear other ideas or not be able to hear other arguments about what's good because they're so corrupting that they might make the wrong decisions for themselves. And this implies that the state knows better than you do about what you should and you shouldn't hear. And even if we're not talking about the state, even if we lived in a country like the US, where they have a constitutional protection against the state controlling speech, there is still lots and lots of private attempts to constrain what speech people can and can't hear, whether it's by, say, deplatforming people, or whether it's by trying to get people fired from their jobs for saying the wrong things, or whether it's trying to really, in any way, say that somebody shouldn't have a voice because what they're saying is wrong. It's not just saying that they're wrong, it's saying that they shouldn't even be allowed to speak because they're wrong. And the enemies of liberalism, I think, have realized that arguing their case, arguing that their opponents are wrong and that they are right, is a lot harder and a lot more difficult to kind of succeed in than just saying that the other people shouldn't have the right to speak, to not even have the debate in the first place. They've realized that it's easier to change the rules of the game than it is to play the game and try and win it. So all this leads to the idea that I have of liberalism, which is liberalism as pluralism, or liberalism as trial and error. This idea of anti-paternalism leads us to a pluralistic idea. So we start with moral egalitarianism. This is the kind of key premise. That leads us to the idea that no person can decide for other people what they should and shouldn't be able to do with themselves. And that leads us to the idea of pluralism, which is this view of society as being lots of different ideas of what's good, lots of different groups, each doing for themselves what they want and not interfering with each other in their own lives. And that pluralism is what gets us to society as being kind of win-win, because that pluralism operates on a trial and error basis. And trial and error, I think, is the kind of the hidden concept in what makes the world, in what makes civilization. So trial and error is what we use in science to progress. In science, we just make guesses. We compare the guesses and the implications of those guesses to the real world, which is what's called an experiment. And if the real world disagrees with if our trial disagrees with the real world, then it's wrong. It's an error, and we throw it away. And this is what we do not just in science, and that's the scientific method. That's how the scientific method progresses. But we do this also in markets by having businesses be set up by entrepreneurs. Businesses go bankrupt. The ones that are successful, that do actually meet consumer demand, make profits. The ones that make a lot of profits get more challengers coming into the market to try to steal their profits away. And each of them is trying basically their own theory of the world, their own theory of what's good in that particular context. And in society, we do the same thing. In society, when you have a pluralistic society, each group is trying their own thing. Each group is is almost like a business or almost like a scientific theory, saying that this is the way life can be good, and trying it out. And most of the time they fail, because most ideas by necessity are wrong, but sometimes they succeed, and then we copy them. And that's the kind of proliferation of good ideas. So pluralism, experimentation, trial and error, these are how we learn about what ideas work and what ideas don't work. And to me, these are the kind of concepts that bring liberalism together. And all of them are very, very different from the centrist idea of politics as kind of moderation, or politics as being, the good idea of politics as being sort of in between these two extremes. It's not. It's a direct challenge to the idea of zero-sum thinking, to the idea of group membership being what defines you, or to the idea that certain people or certain groups, because of their characteristics, have more weight than others. It's a completely different, individual-focused way of looking at the world. So if we were to take this version of liberalism seriously, and we were to say that we wanted to build a kind of liberal agenda, in my view, we could build one that was quite appealing to liberals on the left and liberals on the right. You'll note that everything I've said, although I'm a right liberal, I'm a person who believes in free markets very strongly, and fairly unregulated free markets, though not completely unregulated free markets. I think that I have a lot in common with people on the left who call themselves liberals. And I don't think it's contradictory for people in the US, for example, to use the word liberal to be sort of synonymous with the left. I think that there are very good reasons for being on the left. If you don't agree with basically my empirical beliefs about markets, you can still share all of these values I've laid out, but not be an economic liberal, or not be an economic free marketeer, I should say. But what would a liberal agenda look like if we were trying to unite left liberals and right liberals? So if we acknowledge that extremism on left and right is growing, and there are people who are on the left and there are people who are on the right who share a huge number of important values, who used to be opponents when these were kind of dominant, or when centrism at least was the sort of dominant worldview, but now are not. So my suggestion would be, we would start by saying that the dignity and the respect that we owe to people who are at the bottom of society should be much, much more emphasized, and that our public policies should focus on opportunities and welfare and money to people who are at the bottom of society, and as much as we can, within political constraints, to people who don't live in our countries. So we would want to raise the welfare of foreign people and people who haven't succeeded in life by giving them dignity, respect, opportunity, and money. That might look like a more open immigration policy, particularly in the developed world, a more open immigration policy that makes it easier for people from poorer countries to come and live here. When it comes to welfare policy, it would probably look like something like a basic income or a negative income tax, so that we're just giving people cash at the bottom of society and letting them do what they want with that cash, rather than trying to direct their lives with it. I think we'd say that disgust, sacredness, and offense are not grounds for public policy. So we would try and say that because we're moral equals, it doesn't matter if you're disgusted what I do with my life, and it doesn't matter if what I do seems really offensive to you. You still have to live with that, because I am of moral equal weight to you. I think if we take anti-paternalism seriously, we would try to design public services to provide information and support to people for them to use as they want to use it, rather than forcing them to be good. When it comes to healthcare, for example, we would be trying to make as few decisions as possible on behalf of people, and instead give people the information they need to make the decisions for themselves. And that might mean a lot more people drink or smoke or take drugs, but moral egalitarianism says we can't make a decision about whether they should be able to do that or not. We just have to make sure they know what the consequences are, and then let them do what they want with that. Then I think we would have to move to positive sum politics, a kind of idea of politics as being about growth and about mutual cooperation, rather than about one group getting something because some other group has lost. And I think the way to do that is to focus on the areas where politics really is zero sum. The rent seeking is a sort of coverall term that's been given to groups when politically powerful groups, for example, because they have a lot of votes, or because they're very influential in certain areas, or because they have a lot of power over some kind of narrow area of government policy. And rent seeking can mean that sometimes politics really is zero sum. Sometimes, for example, in the UK or in the United States, homeowners have vetoes on the construction of new homes near them. And what that means is, if new homes are built, their house prices will fall. And so they stop new houses from being built. So it's a zero-sum game. If you win by building a new house, I lose because the value of my house falls. That cannot go on. That's really not just bad for people because it means we don't get enough houses built. It's bad for people because it turns politics into an oppositional fight between people who don't own and people who do own. The only constraint really on these things should be the actual resources that it costs. Again, when it comes to resources, that kind of is a zero-sum game. You know, if you, in the short term at least, if you use the resources to build this house, somebody else can't use those resources to do something else with them. We have markets to adjudicate those problems, but we should be minimizing that kind of trade-off as much as we possibly can. And politics shouldn't be about reinforcing it. In much of the world, including in emerging economies, state-sponsored monopolies are a huge drag on growth. And these are not state-sponsored monopolies because it's good for the economy to have them or because people benefit from having them. They're just there because the people who run the monopolies are politically influential, or they donate money to the politicians who make the decisions, or they're involved with military groups. For example, in Egypt, the army owns a huge amount of the economy. All of these things are drags on growth. They benefit the particular people who run those things, and they cost everybody else. And that's another example of zero-sum politics. When it comes to tax, I'm very easygoing. I believe in probably a slightly lower tax burden, but I think what's really interesting is that we don't need to agree on what level taxation should be to agree that there are lots of ways that we can do taxation better. So we could tax investment less, so that we're not taxing growth and we're not taxing productivity. And we could tax consumption, particularly the consumption of rich people, more. This is a way of saying that the burden on the rich could even be higher than it is now. We could have the same level of taxation, but tax wouldn't be dragging on growth. It wouldn't be as much of a zero-sum calculus as it is right now. And we could design the welfare system so that it's very generous, but it's also very flexible, and so that it complements innovation and complements low regulation, so that people have a safety net, but it's a safety net that doesn't keep them in the same job, that doesn't try to stop businesses from going bankrupt, that doesn't stop change, but it acts as this fallback that people can have, really the true meaning of safety net, rather than as it is in most developed economies, as a kind of an attempt to keep people in stasis, to keep people from leaving their jobs or to keep businesses from going bust. So to sum up, my view is that liberalism really can be seen as egalitarianism and positive sum politics, positive sum approaches to problems. And this kind of focus on growth, individual empowerment, and this idea of competition as trial and error can be applied in all walks of life, in science, in markets, in private society, and that the rejection of centrism by voters isn't a rejection of this idea. It's a rejection of nothing. It's a rejection of a kind of an empty, oh, we take the best from each world, we make the decisions for ourselves. It's really the rejection of a kind of elitism, this sort of elitism that says that this select group can choose the best from all these other things and can make decisions for everybody else about what's good for them. I think liberalism is not that. I think about a centrism. I think liberalism is a much deeper and much more assertive philosophy that's in direct opposition to extremism and in direct opposition to I suppose the idea that life is about zero-sum games and life is about groups triumphing over other groups. And it's that focus on the individual and that focus on allowing each person to flourish as they define flourishing that I think could be not just an intellectually robust marker, or not just an intellectually robust thing for people to believe in, but also something that if offered to voters and if offered to the wider public could be something that they find appealing as well and causes them to reject the extremism that really tells them that life is about conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think it was a very thought-provoking talk, particularly on the various principles that you pointed out that kind of differentiate between what we call centrism and principled liberalism. Before we open to question and answer session with the audience, I have one question for you. This is something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and I think we can find the answer here. Um, you know, it's very different as to how you perceive liberalism, and also depends upon which part of the world you're from. Liberalism, as you pointed out, in the US is something different with the liberalism in maybe in Britain, and if you come to India, liberalism is more or less equated with the left. We call
Mhm.
something called left liberalism. Um, what is the primary factor that sort of creates these multiple identities within liberalism, and how do we position ourselves in such situations? If for example, if I identify myself, or I'm striving to identify myself as a principled liberal, how do I position myself into sort of a semantic quagmire that we're already in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the reason for the difference, at least between the European idea of liberalism and the American idea of liberalism, is that in Europe, the this idea of basically socialism was a much stronger idea in Europe historically than it was in the United States, for lots of reasons to do with kind of general, lots of immigrants leaving places like the Soviet Union and so on had a deep hostility to socialism. Possibly the US economy was not built in the same way. It didn't have the kind of long and kind of huge urban proletariats, kind of urban manufacturing proletariats that existed in Europe. So for lots of reasons, socialism really never took hold in the US. So what became the left grew out of an idea that the state should be there to empower individuals to do what it wants. So the left in the US until recently was never really this kind of trade union based, or although trade unions were always important, but never this sort of class struggle based view of kind of left and right. So instead, you had people who think, well, empowerment, people being able to live the lives that they want to live is what matters, which is, I think, a core liberal belief, an extremely important liberal belief. And their interpretation was that part of that is about having money, part of that is about having resources. So, which again I think is true, and I think that all this is related to the fact, or the phenomenon, that in general the U.S. political center of gravity is much further right than it is in almost any other developed country. Like basically nowhere is a sort of right wing, and it's kind of cliche, but people in the US who are on the left, at least until recently, generally would be considered to be on the right in most European countries. So it may be that it's not that unusual that people on the left in the US are called liberals. It may just be that they're kind of roughly where liberals in Europe would be. And what's weird is that the right are so much further to the right for all sorts of other interesting historical reasons. And when it comes to a country like India, I don't know enough. I wish I could speak to that, but I imagine that, I mean, there's been a huge amount of influence from the US onto European countries. I imagine intellectually that's been true of countries like India as well. And part of that is like the adoption of the language of the US. And so even though in continental Europe, still a liberal for most people connotes being kind of free market. In the UK, really, liberalism doesn't connote being free market anymore. We have a party called the Liberal Democrats, who are kind of somewhere in between the Conservative Party. They're kind of who I would describe as centrists, actually, rather than as liberals. But certainly they're not really considered to be economically right wing, or particularly economically right wing. And I think a lot of that is part of this sort of drift from the US to the rest of the world. I think the other question is this inaccurate? Does it kind of is it wrong to describe those people in the US as liberals? And I think it's not. And one of the arguments that, or one of the kind of points that I try to make, is that we might have different empirical beliefs about, what is the best way of giving people money to allow them to lead good lives. I work as an economist. I work all the time I spend just as much time talking about markets as I do about any other form of individual liberty. So I think it's really important to understand that free markets are the best way, in my opinion, of giving people the resources they need. But I don't think it's illegitimate to disagree with that. And I think that it's very, very possible for very intelligent people many of whom do disagree with that. So it's kind of factual claims about the world. And what I worry about, though, is if people who have those different factual claims end up seeing each other as the main opposition. So if kind of liberals on the left and liberals on the right end up seeing each other as our main opponents, rather than realizing that there's a much bigger thing going on behind us, and really the differences that we have are really trivial. And if we miss that, I think we're really going to suffer, and we're really going to continue doing quite badly. But I think if we can realize that there are huge amounts in common, and that we have huge amounts of values in common, then we might be able to find areas like, for example, housing, where we agree, and we might be able to find might be able to build an economic policy that can unite the left and the right, or left liberals and right liberals. And to me, that could be very promising. And it's one of the reasons I think housing is such an important issue in countries in kind of the Anglo world, the kind of UK, Canada, the USA, because all of these countries have huge housing crises. They have really big problems in the long run because of these. Young people are being kept out of cities, growth is being slowed down. And there's no real obvious left-wing position. There's no reason that a left-winger should be in favor of these restrictions any more than a free marketeer is in favor of those restrictions. So it's building that kind of alliance that I think is really valuable, and could be something that allows us to return to a world, the ideal world, where the debate is between different kinds of liberal, rather than liberals and people who are really deeply anti-liberal.
Thank you so much for that answer. In fact, that tells us a lot about the kind of cultural perspectives also that we have. In fact, in the US, we do have the conservatives who kind of don't like the term right wing when we call them.
Yeah.
They're like, we're conservatives. And we have similar kinds of trends everywhere. The other question, and that's something that's very pertinent, is about nationalism. It's one of the questions here that I have. You talked about moral egalitarianism, and how if we look at nationalism by the nature of it, it's not morally egalitarian, because your moral considerations are more or less governed by imaginary lines drawn on a map. So, but then there is also that there are also nationalists sort of who claim in good faith that though it's not about whether we value human life less on the other side of the border, but it's about priorities. Now, or maybe I love my country, but I do not hate the other. So, what about those kind of people? But is there any principled outlook behind that, or is it just another way of saying the same thing?
No, I think there is a principled. I think there is principle, and I agree with you that one can hold beliefs like that in good faith. I think it's really important to acknowledge that. The kind of extreme version of that argument is to say, well, look, clearly you value your family more than you value somebody that you've never met. Adam Smith talked about this idea that we have sort of circles of compassion. That my family is the most important thing to me, then somebody in my town, then somebody in my city or my country, and then somebody on the other side of the world. And Smith's view was this is kind of an inevitable part of human nature, and we just can't escape this. And really, but kind of interestingly, the point he was making was that even though we have this, we still have sympathy for other people on the other side of the world, and that even though we do have these growing circles of compassion, we still have the people on the other side of the world who we've never met are still people, and they're still part of our circles of compassion. So I think the way I would sort of meet those people halfway, and I agree that, I mean, the nationalism that says that basically our country is superior to other countries is, I think, very dangerous, and I think that is something that we really have to be on alert to, and really have to be worried about. There's also the related nationalism that says our country has been made the victim again and again, and that might be true. It's some countries and some places have been made victims, but it makes much more sense to think of it as individuals being victimized by other individuals than it does to think of it as a sort of class or unit of people being victimized by some other unit of people. Because, for example, as I'm Irish. Ireland was, not the most brutally subjected by the British Empire, and it was actually complicit in some aspects of the British Empire, but it was still subjected by the British Empire and treated quite badly. There can be a tendency among people in Ireland, for example, because they think of the empire as the other people, and they think of us as the victims, to ignore the things that Irish people have done, and to ignore, for example, the crimes of Irish people in the rest of the British Empire. It's thinking of it in such simplistic terms, and thinking of it as, okay, well, we're the victims, they're the bad guys. That means that you completely lose history, you completely lose any kind of sense of nuance, and you build a setup for hatred and for kind of just long, deep resentments. So anything bad that happens to you is a result of somebody else having done it to you. And I think that's the kind of nationalism that's dangerous and that can really lead to kind of terrible outcomes, not just intellectually bad outcomes, but actual death and murder and bigotry in real life. Provided that that's not the sort of thing we're talking about, I think the best way of engaging with people who maybe would call themselves patriots is to acknowledge you clearly have a right to prefer people in your own neighborhood or your own country. I might personally disagree. I don't feel very patriotic, or I don't feel very nationalistic. But you have a right to feel that way. What I ask is that you acknowledge and take into consideration the humanity of everybody else, and you take into consideration that even if they're not part of your family, there are still things that we do to people on other sides of the world, and still rules that we apply to people who aren't in our kind of clan or family, that are completely unjustifiable to another human being. I think that migration controls to a large extent are like that. I think that no family on the planet would have the same kind of rules on, a person from another family not being able to work for your company, for example, or not being able to work for the family business, as we have as a sort of national family, if you want to use that horrible expression, on people who are from outside that national family. So to me, it's like, yes, I understand where people are coming from. If it's made in good faith, and if it's not the kind of we're better than everybody else, or we have some sort of hatred of somebody else, then we should be engaging with it. But my response is just remember that everybody else is human, and think about how do we treat human beings on the other side of the planet. And to me, right now, we treat them very, very badly.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. You touched upon a very interesting topic of immigration, equally controversial in terms of how people in the Western countries see it. But interestingly, we also have a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in our part of the world, which is the South Asian countries as well. What exactly is the most principled liberal position on immigration? Because we, again, if you look at the different answers that you get, some people who identify themselves as libertarians would argue that that immigration and or open borders is a good policy if we do not have the welfare state. And so these are the kind of arguments that are always made. And also the national security argument of having immigrants in it'll lead to an increase in crimes, although the empirical evidence always debunks that claim. But what is that principle idea of immigration?
Well, the welfare state argument always frustrates me for two reasons. The first is that empirically, we know that it's possible to restrict access to the welfare state, but not to restrict access to a country or to a labor market or all of the other things that people are actually looking for when they move countries. So in the UK, for example, you have to live here for a few years before you can access unemployment benefits. You have to have contributed a certain amount in tax before you can access lots of other benefits. We have done that, but so we can make it. We can, if you want to use the expression that Alex Naraste of the Cato Institute uses, build a wall around the welfare state. Don't build a wall around the country. And I think that's one reason I find it very frustrating, because it's just not true that we have to give access to our welfare state to immigrants if that seems to be a problem. The second is, in fact, in aging countries, immigrants are what prop up the welfare state. So far from immigrants drawing and dragging down the welfare state in countries like the United Kingdom, it's immigrants bringing youth and bringing kind of vitality to the country that increase tax returns and allow other people who are native to the country usually to access more generous welfare state benefits. We've got such an aging population, which means we've got more and more people drawing on healthcare and more people drawing pensions, and we're not really giving birth to enough people in the country to sort of pay for that and to maintain the kind of system we would like just based on taxation, that immigrants come in and help us to provide a welfare state. So it's kind of doubly wrong. Not only can we not, not only can we easily restrict people from the welfare state if we want to without restricting them from the country, we can also we'd also be in a much worse position without those people. The point about crime, you're right. It's more or less been rejected. It's probably true for certain immigrant groups that there are kind of higher rates of crime. But generally, my argument is that the best solution to this usually isn't restricting immigration among even those groups. If we found a group of people that committed crimes to such a terrible extent, we might say, okay, fine, we're not going to be as generous with immigration policy with those people. That wouldn't be an argument for everybody else to be restricted. That wouldn't be an argument for immigration in general to be restricted. It would be an argument for a particular group. I suspect that that's not really the case for any group. I suspect that empirically, usually what we're looking at is immigrants who haven't been integrated properly, immigrants who are too poor because they don't have the right opportunities, and often these are things that we can resolve with better policies specifically to those groups. To give an example, in the UK, there's a status of immigrant called an asylum seeker, which is not yet a refugee. It's somebody who would like to become a refugee, but they're in the process of having their application being decided. And while they're asylum seekers, they're not allowed to work. And what a study found was that asylum seekers are much more likely to shoplift, they're much more likely to steal, they're much more likely to do all sorts of kind of petty property-related crimes. But that didn't persist after they were given refugee status. And the reason was that they're not allowed to work. Or the conclusion was that it's the restriction on work and the fact that they're basically living on £5 a day, which means that they kind of resort to petty crime to get a bit more money. So the answer in that case is not to have fewer asylum seekers, it's to avoid the restrictions on them working and allowing them to get access to money. When it comes to terrorism, that's the one that you often get in the UK and in the Western world. I think we need perspective. As bad as terrorism is, you're talking about literally one or two people out of an entire generation of people. You're talking about literally, at the very most, a few dozen people out of millions. Now, that's not to say that those are not important, and it's not to say that the costs aren't really bad, but I'm not convinced that the best way of stopping 10, 20 people from resorting to terrorism is to stop millions of people from making better lives for themselves by coming into your country. I think that really the normal tools that we have, like intelligence, policing, trying to kind of monitor these groups through law enforcement, is a much better way of catching that. It's kind of inevitable that we have to do that anyway, because it's not just immigrants, and it's not just the children of immigrants who are terrorists, it's domestic people as well. So we will need to monitor those people anyway. It's not obvious to me that having immigrant groups significantly increases the cost of doing those things. And I think the cost of not having those people, both for them and for us, would be really, really significant.
Thank you very much, Sam, for this wonderful explanation. The next question that we have, it's a question that's kind of become very relevant to the discussion surrounding liberalism. It's a question from Gautam from India, who asks, he says, liberalism is only restricted to chosen few countries which identify themselves as democracies. And is there a relationship between liberalism and democracy? Is it like a buy one, get one thing, or is it something different? Can liberalism survive in countries that do not necessarily identify themselves as democracies?
That's a really good question. My answer is a slightly boring one. My answer is yes, in theory, but probably not in practice. In theory, I do think democracy and liberalism are different things. I think that democracy is best thought of as a way of removing political leaders that are bad. It's not that great for loads of things. It has huge problems with making decisions. It has, as I've described, huge problems with interest groups having too much influence over the system. If they have a lot of incentive, they can do campaigns that basically mislead people and cause people to vote against their interests. It's really bad for minority groups. If you have a minority group that has a really strong feeling about their way of life, and they're only 5% of the vote, then they're likely to be just trampled over by the majority. And those are all huge problems. But what's good is that it allows us to get rid of leaders that we don't like, or who are doing a bad job, or who are doing an evil job in a peaceful way, and allows us to do it without having a coup or without having a civil war. And the evidence is pretty strong that democracies tend to be better at doing peaceful transfers of power than non-democracies. Now, I don't think it's obvious that those two things should be completely related to liberalism. It's not completely clear why having peaceful transfers of power should also be associated with having a system where people are treated as individuals and where people are treated with the kind of sort of anti-paternalistic respect that I'm advocating for. And yet that does seem to be what happens. It could be just straightforward. It could be that people like liberalism, and so people are more likely to vote for governments that give them some version of a liberal. It's not going to be a kind of perfect liberal utopia, but it's going to be a more liberal situation than they would have otherwise. That's probably the most likely explanation. Or it could be that democratic states, for all of their flaws, are better at not getting captured by extremely exploitative groups than authoritarian states are. That, for example, in an authoritarian state like China, effectively the Communist Party is a sort of parasitic interest group that is kind of exploiting the people of China in the same way that kind of a medieval king or a medieval lord would try to exploit the serfs that lived under him. That's potentially, and then a kind of democracy gives you a way of getting rid of people like that more easily than any other system. So that could be why this relationship exists. Clearly, in practice, it does exist. I think we can imagine situations where it might not exist. I mean, an example might be Hong Kong, which before 1997 wasn't really a democracy. It was basically ruled by a kind of British appointee, and yet was a liberal country, and it was much more liberal than any other kind of country in that particular region. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's also worth remembering because democracy isn't liberalism. It's worth thinking about the kind of constraints that we might want to put on democracy, whether through a constitution or whether through other means, because we don't want democracy to be unlimited, because unlimited democracy can be very, very illiberal. But we don't ever, I think, want to give up this ability to get rid of leaders when they're misbehaving and when they're trying to kind of basically parasite themselves on the rest of the population.
Thank you so much. Can we take one more question? We have
Sure.
A question sort of from a European audience. Is which European political group is more close to liberalism and how?
That's a very difficult question for me to answer because I don't follow politics, even in the UK, as closely as I might. And I don't really want to name a particular group because it will turn out that they've done something terrible that I really, really disagree with. Yeah, I mean, without wanting to, like, I do basically think that the kind of liberal mainstream that we see in Europe, including groups like the FDP in Germany, some of I think Slovakia has quite a strong liberal group. I think the Netherlands and Belgium both have fairly successful liberal parties. What's interesting is that none of them are really that liberal. All of them are very much kind of this sort of centrist sort of mindset where, really it's about getting smart people in charge, and smart people can make the decisions, and it doesn't really matter what they think. Now, one way of reading that is to say that that's what you need to do to survive, and that's what you need to do. But on the other hand, in lots of these countries, these parties are sort of always teetering on the edge, and it may be that parties that have established themselves that are able to make a slightly more robust case for kind of practical liberalism. I don't mean the sort of thing I've been talking about where you say, oh well, we're against paternalism and we're against whatever, and we're in favor of moral egalitarianism, but sort of practical things where we say, we are in favor of people's right to drink alcohol, and we think that the right to drink alcohol is really important. And this is a huge subject in the UK and Ireland at the moment because they want to bring in more constraints through minimum alcohol pricing. And having a group that says, we are in favor of free speech, even when we disagree with the speech. We're in favor of a system that doesn't change the tax level necessarily, but does change how we do the taxation. These are things that might be more popular, or they might be popular after they've seen results. So it might be a case of we need to get into power somehow, kind of through what means that I don't really know about, rhetorical means, saying things I'm not really sure what you would say. And then when you do it, if you can implement the right agenda, then you become really popular because you've got growth and you've got all these things. What I do know is that I think that politics in the UK and in Europe is generally quite depressing. And I think that whatever groups there are, I don't really want to be critical of them, even if I might disagree with them on things, because they're the kind of best of a bad bunch. And what I'm most troubled by is the sort of lurch, even by establishment parties, towards protectionism and towards real kind of national authoritarianism, and kind of at best to this idea of Europe as a protectionist nation, rather than Germany or France or Italy as a nation, which isn't that much better. It's probably better than having each country seeing itself as a sort of nationalistic unit, but it's not that much better, because it just changes what level we're arguing that we should have a nation at, and what level we should have protectionism at. So I don't want to criticize those groups, even though they're all a bit kind of squishy for me.
Thank you so much. That was indeed an answer that encompassed more or less the principles, rather than talking about which particular party is the most liberal. Like, we just give them a
Sorry not to answer. Yeah, I feel bad, but I don't really.
I think people will make their wisest judgment based on the principles that you talked about, and then kind of compare it with the manifestos of those parties. I think that'll lead them to a far more clearer idea of whether they are liberal or not. Thank you so much, Sam. It has been a wonderful conversation. I have many key takeaways from this conversation, and we want to appreciate you for accepting the invitation for this webinar. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.